Okay, it's time to get started. Thank you everyone for joining our live lecture this morning. My name is Isaac and I'll be the lead instructor for the lecture. And today's topic is going to be Front-End Foundations Part 1. So what that means is this lecture will cover the first half of the Front-End Foundations curriculum. So if you're in that section, this is a lecture for you. A couple of things to mention before we get started. The first one being is we're going to stop periodically throughout this lecture to open the floor for questions. So we just ask that if you do have questions come up along the way, you just ask them until those designated, you just wait until those designated times to ask your questions. And also another thing to mention is that we're recording this lecture. So once we're done here, we're going to post it on our YouTube channel. We're going to make that link available to you in your student dashboard. Okay, so let's go ahead and discuss the main topics we're going to be going over today. And today is actually going to be review of concepts you've already been introduced to, okay? And the three concepts are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's start off by going to the documentation for those technologies and doing a brief recap. Okay, so HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and this is simply the structural language for our page, right? Just creates like a skeleton. Okay, and then CSS is Cascading Style Sheets, and this is what adds styles and cosmetics to our page, right, on top of the skeleton. And then we've got what's called JavaScript, and JavaScript's a scripting language which basically allows us to create browser interactions like button click events and things of that nature to make our program come to life. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off by creating a base project right on our desktop. Okay, and let's just call this Front-End Foundations, and then let's open that up inside of our text editor. Just give that a minute to boot up. Okay, so first, let's go ahead and create an HTML document inside of our Word directory. Okay, and I'm going to call this document index.html. Okay, from here, we need to create what's called the HTML skeleton. Okay, and so we're going to start off by putting the parent element for our HTML doc, and then we're going to go ahead and pass in a head, and this head is going to have the title of the document. Okay, and we'll just say this is Front-End Foundations. Okay, and then right below the head, we'd have the body, right? Just like, you know, an animal or a human, right? It's this kind of same structure in that regard. Okay, so the body is going to be all the visible content on the page. Okay, they're not going to be able to, you know, see all the metadata between the head. They will be able to see the title, but other things not so much. Okay, so the visible content goes here. And so we could just put something like hello world for now. It's just some raw text. Okay, so now to view this document, we can simply copy the path and then head back to our browser here. And let's just paste that in the URL. Okay, and as you can see, we're getting that text printed out. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can inspect our browser and we can go to the network tab, okay, and we could see that every time that the browser is refreshed, it's loading in our document right here, okay? So now we know our text is rendering. Let's go ahead and let's talk about common body elements that we use to create different parts of a web page. Okay, so the first body element we'll talk about is a header. Okay, so let's say we're writing an article and we want to put the title or the subject of the article. Okay, so we'd want to probably draw attention to that with some bigger text with emphasis on it. So that's where a header would come into play. And headers come in the form of H tags. So you got H1, H2, and all the way up to H6. Okay, and so how it works is they've got default font sizes built into them where H1 is the largest and then it scales down to H6, which is the smallest. So let's go ahead and let's just put an H1 and let's say our article is about how to code, okay? And so if we go ahead and say ball and we refresh, okay, we can see now that this text has more emphasis on it. It's much larger, right? And so it appears much more like the article title versus just the raw text of the article itself, okay? And you'll notice that that's nested between the body here, okay? That's how it's getting rendered. So let's say now we want to add some text to our article, okay? And so this is where another common body element called a paragraph tag would come into handy. Okay, so paragraph element works really easy. We just use the letter P, okay, and then we put the text we want to, you know, render. So I'm just going to say, put some placeholder text here, and then I'll copy and paste that a few times just to create, you know, a decent sized paragraph. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can save all, and we go back to our browser, we refresh, okay, and we can see that right below our article, we're getting, you know, the text of the article, right? And it's proportionate to the size of the title itself, okay? And so this is one of the most common elements you're going to see, because there's, you know, there's text everywhere online, right? Pretty much every web page is going to have some text somewhere, so you're going to be utilizing this one a lot. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and talk about another common body element, lists. Okay, so let's say within our article, we want to list off different things that someone's going to have to know to learn how to code. So to do this, we could use what's called an unordered list or an ordered list. Okay, so an ordered list is if like you're giving directions, it'll give you like numerical bullet points, versus an unordered list will simply give us bullet points, and they won't be numbers. Okay, so let's start with an ordered list so you can see how that works. We first create the parent order list element, and then we nest child elements inside it for list items. So I'm going to say this is task 1, and then I could just nest more list items within this parent element here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's save all, and let's refresh. Okay, and as we can see, we're getting this nice little list here, right? And it automatically numbered those for us. So that way we don't have to sit here and hard code those, right? And go 1, 2, right? That would be terrible, especially with dynamic lists where we don't actually know the number of items being rendered until, you know, something is actually retrieved from the database. Okay, so now let's go ahead and change this to an unordered list by just simply saying UL instead of OL. Okay, and now it's going to just put bullet points next to each of these instead of a numeric value. Okay, so when we refresh the browser, we can see that we're getting, you know, just these general bullet points here. Okay, and that's how we can create list elements. So moving right along, let's go ahead and let's say that once we're done with the article here, we want a you know, contact us form in case someone has a question about the article. Okay, so we could put, let's do maybe an H3 down here, and we'll put contact us, and then we could put what's called a form element. The form element is what's going to hold our inputs and our buttons and things for submitting information. Okay, so I'm going to simply say form. Okay, and within this form, I'm going to put an input, and we'll have a placeholder for their email. And then we'll go ahead and we will put the button for submitting the form, and we'll just say submit here. Okay, and then we could even put a text area if we wanted, right? So let's go ahead and do that so they can actually tell us, you know, what they need. Okay, and so for this text area, let's just give it a placeholder and say this comments go here. Okay, So let's save all, and let's refresh. Okay, and as we can see, they can submit their email, they can submit their comments, and they can click the button to actually submit, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up the topic of HTML elements with an anchor element. Okay, so an anchor element is going to allow us to navigate to a third-party source. Okay, so let's just say that we want to navigate to the HTML web page. So we could simply put an anchor element with an href attribute that is pointing to that web page URL, and then we could say view HTML docs for the context of the anchor. Okay, so now we could save all. When we refresh our browser, we can see that this link is linked to the actual web page for the HTML docs. When we click on it, it loads in that web page. Okay, and just like we can navigate to a third-party web page, we can also navigate to our own internal web pages, right? So let's say, you know, this is our home page, but we also have an about page. So if we wanted to use our anchor tag to navigate to an about page, first we would just need to create the about page. So let's just create an about HTML. And then we'll throw a simple HTML skeleton in here. You know, we'll just start with the parent element, and then we'll put a head, and then we'll put a title. And the title will just be about. And then we'll put a body. And inside the body, we'll say a header tag, hello from about page. Okay. So from here, instead of pointing to this third-party source, we could say about HTML. And then we could say about us will be the name of the link. Okay, so now we can save all, we can refresh, and the user can now navigate to other pages inside our website, right? And so as you can see, the anchor tag has, you know, a couple different uses in that way. But, you know, mainly it's just to navigate us to web pages. Okay, so moving on from HTML, let's go ahead and let's dive into the review for CSS. Okay, so to start off, let's go ahead and let's erase our current form here. Okay, and let's just put a header tag which says hello world. Okay, and let's say we want to add some styles to our website. Okay, well, to do this, we would need to use CSS. Okay, and so to use CSS, we first need to start off by creating a CSS file to store all of our styles in. Okay, so I'm just going to create a style or a file called styles CSS. Okay, and then I need to link this within my document, so whenever the document loads in the browser, it also loads in my styles. Okay, so what I'm going to do is right below the title, I'm going to put in a link. This link is going to be pointing to styles.css. Okay, and so now let's go ahead and let's save all. And we're going to refresh our browser. We can see it's not only loading in our document, but it's also loading in our style sheet. Okay, so because CSS is native to the browser, just like HTML is, it's going to automatically apply any styles that are in here. Okay, and so how CSS works is it allows us to use something called a selector to select specific elements on the page and apply specific styles to them. Okay, and so there's different kinds of selectors we can use. And so let's just start off by saying if we only had, you know, a single element and that's the only element we needed to style, then we could use what's called an ID selector. And how an ID selector works is we simply give the element an ID attribute, and we'll just make it equal to my L for now. Okay, and then we could go to our style sheet, and to target that ID, we could simply use a hashtag, and we could say my L. Okay, and then within the selector here, we could actually place styles via key value pairs. Okay, so when I see key value pairs, I mean if we were to change the color of that element to red, we would simply put color for the key, and then the value would be the actual colors. So let's just say red. Okay. And so now it's going to target all elements with this name or this ID, and it's going to apply that style. So let's go ahead and let's save all. And we refresh our browser. We can see that we get hello world in red. And that's because it's applying the style from this ID selector. Okay. So now let's say we have a farewell down here, right? And so now we can no longer use the ID selector, right? Because I can't use the same ID for this element here. And if I were to create another ID but the same style in my style sheet, I'd be repeating myself. Okay, so to get around this, we can use what's called an element selector. Okay, and so because these are the same element type, I don't actually need to reference them by ID. I can just reference them by their element type. Okay, so now inside my style sheet here, I'm going to say H1, and then I'm going to put color blue. Okay, and now all the H1 elements will have that style applied to them. So we save all, and we refresh. As we can see, we get the styles applied accordingly. Next, now let's say we have a variety of different elements. Okay, so let's say we have an H2 here that says something, and then an H3 that says something else. Okay, so now we can no longer target these by their element because, you know, they have all different element types, and if we were to use separate IDs for each of these, they'd have the same style in here, and that'd just be repeating ourselves. So now when we have a group of elements that have, you know, a variety of different types, we can use what's called a class selector to group them together. Okay, so how I can do this is I'll say the class for this element is going to be equal to color red. Okay, and then I could just apply that same class to every element I wanted to apply that style to. Okay, and it doesn't really care about the element's type now. So from here inside my style sheet, to use a class selector, I simply put a dot, and then we'll put color red, the name of the class. Then we'll pass in our key value pair, which would be color red. And that is going to apply that style to all three elements. So we save all, and we refresh. And as you can see, regardless of the element type, it applies that style all the same. Alrighty, so now we've covered these static selectors. Let's go ahead and let's go over a pseudo selector. Okay, and a pseudo selector is simply a style that is only applied when a specific browser event is happening. Okay, so a very common one today is hover. You'll notice oftentimes when you're on a website, if you hover over specific parts of the page, it will light up or it'll do something. And that's because a pseudo selector style has been applied to it. Okay, so to explore this, let's go ahead and let's just back this up to a single greeting. And then let's go ahead and assign this an ID because this is the only element we want to change. So we'll go ahead and say myL. Okay, and then inside our style sheet, we'll go ahead and target myL. And then to apply a pseudo selector, we'll put a colon here, and then I'll put the event in which I want to apply the style, which in my case is hover. Okay, so now each time the myL element is hovered over, it will apply the color red style. But when it is not hovered over, it won't apply any style. Okay, so now we can save all, and we can refresh, and as we see, it only applies that style whenever we hover over that specific element. Okay, and that's just one pseudo selector. There's actually a ton of them, so feel free to explore more of those in the documentation as you are curious. But moving on, let's go ahead and let's talk about nested selectors. Okay, so a nested selector is when we want to target the child elements of a parent element and only apply styles to those specific elements. Okay, because as you might remember, the rule of CSS is the styles of the parent are applied to the styles of the child. So if we want to get around applying them to the parent and the child, we have to use a nested selector to accomplish this. So let's go ahead and let's start by creating a form. And inside this form, we'll put an input, and we'll give us input, just a placeholder for maybe a name. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and put a button in here as well for submitting information. So the idea here is we don't want to change the style of the form. We just want to change the style of these children elements. Okay, so to start by targeting the input, I can simply do something like this. I can say form input. And now I can go ahead and I can pass in a specific style. In this case, I'm just going to say background color yellow. Okay, and the same way I did the input, I can also target this button element. Okay, and so I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm going to say form button, and I'm just going to change the color of the button text to red. Okay, and by doing this, we've gotten around having to style, the parent as well. We could just leave that alone and only target the specific elements we want. So we save all, and we refresh, and as you can see, we apply those styles accordingly. Okay, so moving on from the topic of selectors, let's now talk about the CSS box model. Okay, so every element that you create has a box model. Okay, and you can imagine it as this invisible box around your element. Okay, and this box has 3 different layers. So the first layer of the box is known as the padding, okay, and that's the space on the inside of the box. Second layer is the border, and that's the space between the inside and outside spacing. And then you've got the outside spacing of the box, which is referred to as the margin. So let's go ahead and create an element, and let's apply all 3 of these styles to that element. Okay, so I'm going to just give it an ID of my L. And then we'll go ahead and we'll say hashtag my L. And from here, we'll go ahead and start by applying a padding. Okay, and because boxes have 4 corners, or 4 different sides, same with when we pass in the padding dimensions. Okay, so start with the top, and we'll just say 10 pixels on each side. Okay, next let's give it a border. Now, border works is we first have to specify the thickness of the border, and I'll just say it's 1 pixel, and then we have to put the style of the border, which I'll just say is solid, and then the color of the border, which I'll just say is black. Okay, and then finally, we'll put the margin. Okay, and again, margin is the spacing on the outside of the box. So I'm just going to put 50 pixels for each side. Okay, and so from here we can save all, and we can refresh our browser. And as we can see, now it has some spacing on the outside and the inside of the box, right? And so we can inspect this more closely if we look at our elements and we simply inspect, okay? And as we can see down here, it has a box model, and we can hover over specific elements, and it's showing us, each layer that has been applied. Okay, so this is how we can move content around the page and adjust it, in a way that is appealing and nice looking for our end user. So moving on from the box model, let's go ahead and let's talk about font families. Okay, now we can change our font style. So by default, the browser loads in a handful of fonts that we can immediately just use out of the box. Okay, so let's say we want to change the style of all the text between the body. So to do this, I'm simply going to target the body element. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and pass in the font family. As you can see, there's a bunch of, built-in fonts, and I'm just going to use monospace. Okay, so from here, I can go ahead and save all. And when we refresh, no, looks like it's not loading that in. Let's try this again. Well, I might be spelling it wrong then. Okay, well, let's just pick a cursive. Okay, save all, refresh. There we go. Okay, so as we can see, it applies that style. Okay, I probably was just spelling the other one wrong or something. But you get the idea where we're changing the appearance of our font. And although these built-in browser fonts do work, they are kind of limiting, and sometimes we have very specific styles that we've got to make our web page comply with. So that being said, we want the ability to bring in our own custom fonts if needed. Okay, and so there's many custom font providers out there, but probably the most popular and free version is Google Fonts. Okay, so let's just go ahead and let's navigate to Google Fonts. Okay, so we'll just type in Google Fonts. And as we can see, it just loads in a bunch of different fonts we can use by a bunch of different authors. And so let's say we want this lobster one here, right? So we'll view the specimen, right? We'll make sure we like all the casing, all the characters, the performance, everything else. If it checks out, we'll go ahead and we'll select the font, and then we'll use the standard embed right here. So we'll just copy the link, go to our index, and then we need to load it in before our custom style sheet, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put a link to load in the lobster font. Okay, so now here in my style sheet, I can apply that font family. Okay, and as you can see, I can also pass in a backup font in case this one fails to load. Okay, so let's just go ahead and copy this, and we'll paste it in just like this. Okay, so we save all, and go to our browser and refresh. And as you can see, now our text is getting that custom font applied. Okay, and as you see, it really wasn't that hard, right? Just a matter of bringing in the appropriate link and then referencing that in our style sheet. Okay, so moving on from fonts, let's go ahead and wrap up the CSS review with the topic of media queries. Okay, so media queries are ways that we can logically apply styles when specific expressions evaluate to true. Okay, so for example, the most common use of a media query today is when a screen width gets to a specific size, certain styles are applied to elements to hide them or show them or change their dimensions to better fit that screen. Okay, and so let's just go ahead and use that same approach by changing the font size of this element when the screen gets above 800 pixels. Okay, so how I'm going to apply that is I'm going to target the element through a media query. Okay, so we'll start off by saying media, and then we'll pass in our rule, which is the expression that must evaluate to true to apply the style. Okay, so I'm going to say the min width of the screen has to be 800 pixels. Okay, so if it's above that, then it will apply this style. Okay, so then we can target the element, and we can just say myl, and then we will give it a different font size. Okay, so we'll say font size, and let's just say 15 pixels. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh our browser. Okay, and we can see because it's over, the 800, it's a min width of 800 right now, it's applying the style. But watch what happens as soon as I go below 800, right? Because that no longer evaluates to true, it's going to then reverse and not apply the style. Okay, so as you can see, this makes for great responsive web pages. Okay, and we're not stuck with just this one rule here. We really can mix it up. If we want, we could do max width instead, so it only apply that style if it was below instead of above. So we could refresh, and we can see every time we go below 800 now, that's when it applies the style. Okay, so we do have lots of flexibility with the media query and what rules we pass in here. So that being said, we've covered a good review of HTML and CSS up until this point. So let's go and open up the floor, and let's see if anyone has any questions so far. Okay, so the floor is open. Feel free to ask away. Okay. I'll take your silence as a no, and we'll continue. So next, we're going to review JavaScript, okay? And so first things first, just like CSS, we need to create a JavaScript file and then link it here in our doc. So I'm just going to create a file called app.js in my root directory, and then I'll load it in down here, okay? So just going to say app scripts, go here, and then for the script source, I'm going to point to app.js. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's save all, and let's refresh our browser. And oops, there we go. Let's go back to network. And as we can see, not only is it loading in our style sheet and our doc, but it's also loading in our script. Okay, so we know that because JavaScript is native to the browser, it's going to immediately execute anything that's in the script. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the script file, and let's start off by talking about JavaScript variables. Okay, so JavaScript variables are simply stored containers for browser memory. Okay, so we can store values in these little containers, and they will survive as long as the browser session survives. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's start off by learning about the different kinds of variables that there are in JavaScript, because there's more than one. So the first kind and most traditional approach to creating JavaScript variables is to use the var keyword. Okay, and then you're going to follow that up by declaring the name of the variable. And the name of the variable is normally going to be intuitive to what data you're storing. Okay, so let's say we want to store a greeting. Okay, so if we wanted to store a greeting, we could name our variable greeting. We can make it equal to a raw formatted text, which is referred to as a string data type. Okay, and so how we could pass this in is between a pair of quotes. We could say, hello world. Okay, and then from here we can use a diagnostics tool called console log to evaluate the value of greeting when the browser runs. Okay, so let's save all, and let's open up our console, and when we refresh, we can see that we're getting hello world. Okay, and that's because the browser is evaluating the value of greeting to the string hello world. Okay, and so just like var, we can use another keyword called let to create a JavaScript variable. Okay, and the big difference between let and var comes later when we discuss functions and then how they behave inside functions. But for now, just know that how we assign the value of the variable to the let keyword is exactly the same as var. Okay, so if we were to save all, we were to refresh, we can see that we get the same exact value, right? They both store a variable value, okay? It's just that let uses something called block scope and var does not. So although var is the more common traditional approach, let is kind of like the new kid on the block because it's improved performance. Okay, so we recommend that you use let from now on over var because it does have that block scope feature, which we'll go over later. So now let's go ahead and let's discuss the dynamic nature of these variables. Okay, so dynamic means we have the ability to change them after creation. So if I wanted on line 2 here, I could change the greeting to hi. Okay, and then if I ran that in a console log, well, because the script reads from top to bottom, what's going to happen is it's going to start by assigning the value of greeting to hello world, but it's going to reassign it to hi on line 3 here. And because that's the last thing that was assigned to in memory, that's what we're going to get in our console log printed out. So if we save all and we refresh our browser here, we can see that we get the reassigned value. Okay? And really, it doesn't stop there. You can literally just keep reassigning it, and it will just keep changing as you need it to. So let's say, hola. Okay. So we'll save all, refresh. Okay, and as you can see, it really just goes off the last thing it was declared in memory. That's simple as that. So, although this is useful for things like incrementing likes or points, or it's keeping track of things and dynamically changing them. There are times where we want to create variables which can't be changed after creation. And something like a company name would be a good example, right? If we have a company name, we know that it's probably never going to change for the life of the website, so we don't want that variable value to be overwritten like we've seen with the greeting here, right? Because that would be really bad. So what we could do to protect that variable is we could use something called a constant. Okay, so constant uses the const keyword when declare the name of the variable, which I would just call something like company name, and then we could say it's Isaac's company. Okay, so from here we could go ahead and console log the value of company name. And when we refresh, we can see that it prints out the value, okay? No surprises there. But watch what happens now when we try to reassign the value of company name to another company. So when we refresh, we can see that we get an error, right? And the error tells us you basically can't do that because the assignment is to a constant variable. But that's good, right? We've just protected our variable from being reassigned. Okay, so there's specific situations you're going to want dynamic variables. In that case, you use the var or let keyword. And then there's going to be other instances where you're not going to want it to be able to change, right? You're going to want it to remain static. So if that's the case, then you would use a constant. Okay, so moving on, let's go ahead and let's talk about some other data types we can store inside these variables. Okay, so we've already covered this string data type here, which is pretty simple, right? It's just raw formatted text between a pair of quotes. But there are some other data types that are very useful and practical for our operations within our program. So the next kind of variable value data type we'll discuss is a number, okay? And so the reason this is useful is because it allows us to add variable values together. So let's say we have an age, okay? So say my age equals 99. And then let's say we want to create a variable which will represent next year's age. Okay, and so because we made this a number, right, we didn't put a pair of quotes around it, that gives us the ability to perform a mathematical operation with it. So I can simply say my age plus 1. And now it's going to return the value of that, and we will console log that to our browser. So we save all, and we refresh. And as we can see, we get the result of my age plus 1. Okay? And we're not limited to just addition. We can do subtraction, multiplication, division, right? You're really not limited in that regard. It's just basic math operations. So Another data type we'll discuss is called a Boolean, okay? And a Boolean can be one of two values, true or false, okay? And so let's go ahead and create a variable. We'll call it let can Coke. And I'll go ahead and pass true in for the value. Okay, and as you can see, all I did was I passed in the English word true without any quotes, right? And that's how the browser knows to interpret it, as a Boolean, okay? And so from here, we can see that it'll print out accordingly. Okay, and then I could swap that up if I need to. I could say can dance, and because that's not true, I could put something like false, okay? And when we refresh the browser, you can see it prints out that value. And that's really all there is to Booleans, right? They're one of two values, okay? And this really goes back to the very fiber of how computers interpret programming commands from these languages, such as JavaScript, okay? Because as you know, programs only think in ones and zeros, in binary. And so when those are broken down, it really evaluates to true or false, okay? And so this is where Booleans really help us to help the computer make decisions based off of our browser script, okay? And so, for example, if something is true, do this computer, but if this is false, do this computer, right? And so this is where Booleans really, come into play and are used very, very often. So next, let's go ahead and let's discuss another data type called an object. Okay, so a JavaScript object is simply a single variable which can contain a collection of key value pairs. Okay, so up until this point, we've been using single variable values, which is okay to get started, but it's not very scalable once we have a large program. So for example, if we had a program which had some users in it, and we were to use single variable value entities, it would look something like this. We'd say user1 name equals Joe, let user2 name equals Jane. Okay, and then if we wanted to add other information, we'd have to keep going. We have to say user1 age equals 99. Let user2 age equals 100, okay? And as you can see, with just two users, this is getting really out of hand really quickly, right? The information's not very organized. It feels very repetitious, like we're repeating ourselves, and it's, overall not very efficient, okay? So instead of writing everything out in single variable entities, we could use objects. Okay, so I'm going to start off by creating a variable called person1 equal to a pair of curly brackets, okay? Inside this pair of curly brackets, I can pass in key value pairs. Okay, so for the first key, I'm going to say name. For the value, I'm going to put Joe. And then I can add more key value pairs by simply separating them with a comma. Okay, so I could put age as well, and I'll put 99. So as you can see, now I have one variable value containing multiple pieces of information. Okay, so now I can do person2, and I can give them a name, Jane, and I can give them an age, 100. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's console log the value of person1. So from here, we can save all, and we refresh. As you can see, we're getting the value of person1, right? The entire object. And now comes the question, okay, well, how do we get the values out of this object? Okay, so the answer is we can use dot notation or we can use bracket notation. Now, dot notation works is we simply reference the object and use a dot, then we reference the property on the object we want the value for. So if I want the name of person1, I would say person1.name. From here, we could save all and refresh. We can see we get the value of that key in that object instead of just the entire object itself. Okay? And so the other approach we mentioned, bracket notation, works very similar. We just reference the object, maybe person 2, and then we use a pair of brackets, and then we reference the key in which we want the value for. So maybe I want person 2's age. I can use bracket notation like this to accomplish that. So if we save all and we refresh, we can see that we get 100. Okay, and as we know, that is the correct amount. Okay, so moving on from JavaScript data type. Oh, actually, there's one last one let's cover. Almost skipped it. Then the last one we're going to talk about is called an array. Okay, and an array really is just an object that uses index positioning instead of these custom key value pairs here. Okay, so let's say we have a collection of friends we want to store inside a variable value. Okay, so to do this, we could create a variable called friends, and then we can make it equal to a pair of square brackets. Okay, and this is the symbol for array. And then instead of passing in key value pairs, we just pass in single values. Okay, so I would say something like Joe, Jack, Jill, and Jane. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's console log the value of friends. So we save all, and we refresh. We can see that we get our array back. But you might notice that each array now has a number that accompanies its position. Okay, and this is how we can get the value from the array, similar to how we got the value from our object. Okay. So if I wanted to say get the value of Joe, well, because Joe is at the index of 0, I would have to reference 0. So I would say friends at the index of 0. And as you can see, I'm just using bracket notation to access that value. So from here, we could save all, and we could refresh. And as you can see, instead of getting the entire array back, now we get only that specific value. Okay, and then we really could just adjust the index position as we need different values. So because Jane is at the index of 3, I can simply pass in friends at the index of 3 to change that value being displayed. So we'll go ahead and refresh. As we can see, we're getting Jane now. Okay, so now moving on, let's go ahead and let's talk about JavaScript conditionals. Okay, so the most common kind of conditional you're going to run into is called an if statement. Okay, and conditionals are ways of telling our program to take certain steps based on certain logistical expressions. Okay, and so how an if statement works is we simply use the if keyword, and then inside this parentheses field here, we're going to pass in an expression. So for now, I'll just pass in 10 is greater than 5. I'll put a pair of brackets following that. Okay, and so what happens is the browser evaluates this expression. And if it evaluates to true, then it runs this block of code. Okay, so we'll just console log 10 is greater than 5. And however, if this value is false, it will ignore this block of code. Okay, so to test this out, let's save all, and we refresh our browser. We can see that it lets us know 10 is greater than 5 because the browser evaluated this to true. So in the same way, if we were to pass in 10 is greater than 50, now it's going to ignore this block of code because this evaluates false. So if we were to save all and refresh, you can see that we don't get anything printed out. Okay, and that's because it's ignoring this block of code. So there's really nothing else to do in the script. Okay, and that's where the else statement comes in. Okay, so an else statement allows us to execute a secondary condition in the event that this first, evaluation evaluates to false. Okay, so in the event that it does evaluate to false, I'll go ahead and say none of the above. Okay, so now we can save all, and we can refresh. We can see that it ignores the first block of code because that's false, and then it runs this secondary block instead. Okay? And so if we wanted to extend this if logic even further and we wanted to evaluate more than one expression, we could use something called an else if statement. So how an else if statement works is we simply pass in else if, and then we pass in another condition. So I'll say if 4 is greater than 3, then we'll go ahead and we will console log 4 is greater than 3. And then we can throw our final else condition in. We could say none of the above. Okay, so from here we could save all. What's going to happen is, because this evaluates to false, it's going to ignore this code. This will evaluate to true, so it's going to run this code, and it will ignore this else code. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh. You can see that lets us know 4 is greater than 3. Okay, and basically we could just keep adding on as many else if statements as we want to, you know, make our program take the necessary steps that we need it to. And then if it can't find any condition that's true, it'll just finally run our else statement. So now let's change this up to say 4 is greater than 30. And because it won't be able to find any true values expressed through, you know, these two evaluations, it will then run our else statement. And as you can see, none of the above is what we get printed out. Okay, so next, let's talk about JavaScript loops. Okay, so oftentimes we're going to be dealing with large collections of data which we don't know the length of. Okay, if we don't know the length of something, that means we don't know the index position of the items in the array. If we don't know the index position, we aren't going to be able to access those values and perform needed operations on them. So this is where a loop comes into play. And a loop is simply a piece of code that iterates through our given collection of data and allows us to perform a function for each item. Okay, so let's start off by creating a collection of friends. We'll make it equal to Joe, Jack, and Jane, and Jill. Okay, and let's say we don't know how many friends we have, okay? Unknown number. But we want to greet each one. Okay, so how we could do this is we could start off by creating what's called a for loop. So for loop works like this. We use the for keyword, then we have to pass in 3 different arguments. First argument is where we want to start the loop. And because we want to start the index of 0, and declare the variable I equal to 0. Next, we have to tell the loop when to stop or exit. So I'm going to tell the loop to keep going as long as I is less than friends.length. Okay, and then finally, I got to tell I how much to increment each loop, which I'm going to just do 1. Okay, so now within this block here, I have access to each value within the array. So I can go ahead and I can console log hello plus friends at the index of I. And because I is equal to 0 on the first loop, it's going to say hello Joe, because friends at the index of 0 is Joe. Then the second loop, I will increase to 1, and friends at the index of 1 is Jack, so it's going to say hello Jack, and then it's going to keep increasing until this expression is no longer true, at which time it will exit. Okay? And yeah, that's a JavaScript loop. Next, let's go ahead and talk about JavaScript functions. Okay, so JavaScript functions are just executable, repeatable blocks of code. And as you can imagine, that's very important for maintaining a dry program. So let's go ahead and start by talking about the different kinds of JavaScript functions there are. Okay, and there's 2 main approaches. So the first one is by creating a JavaScript function statement. How we create a function statement, we start off by using the keyword function, and then we follow it up with the name of the function. And the name of the function is normally intuitive to what the function does. So let's say we're going to have this function greet. So we'll call it greet. Then we'll put a parameter field next to it. which is just a field where we'll be able to access our function arguments. Okay, and so to run this function, this block of code, we have to reference the function name, greet, and then we have to invoke it just like this. And from here, we can pass in the name of the person we're greeting. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'll say Joe. Okay, and so now this argument that was passed in can be populated in this parameter field. And a parameter is just a representational value of the argument. Okay, so I'm just going to pass in name or n for name, and this is going to contain the value of the argument that was passed in. So from here, we can go ahead and we can console log hello plus n. Okay, so if we save all and we refresh our browser, we can see that it says hello Joe. Okay, and again, that's a function statement. Now, the second approach is referred to as a function expression. And this is very much just where we declare a variable equal to a function. Okay, and now let's go ahead and let's run this same script in the browser. And as you can see, we're getting the same result. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, well, what's the big difference between these two? You know, they seem to execute the same in the way that we invoke them and things of that nature. So there's a couple, underlying differences. The first one is because the function expression is technically a variable, we have the ability to pass it to other functions in a nested callback situation. The disadvantage with the function expression would be that because it's a variable, we can only invoke it below the declaration. Okay, so if we were to take our invocation here, and we were to move it above the declaration, well, now the browser won't have time to load this in, and it's going to throw an error because it won't recognize what greet is. But don't take my word for it. Let's save all and refresh. And as we can see, it lets us know that greet is not defined. Okay. On the flip side, a function statement does not matter where we invoke it. So if we were to change this back to function statement, well, now we can invoke it above or below. And because it's not a variable, it will just look for that function. Okay, so we'll save all and we refresh. As you can see now, get a nice clean execution. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and let's talk about object methods. Okay, so just like we can have string values and number values and all that inside our method, or I'm sorry, inside of our object, we can also have a function as the value of one of our keys as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a person variable, which will have a name. And instead of just passing in a hard-coded name, I'm going to pass in a function which will return the name. Okay, so now to console log that value, we would have to say person, and we can use dot notation to access the name, and then we would invoke it. And because it returns a string, that's what should be printed out. Okay, so from here, let's save all, and let's refresh our browser. As you can see, we get Joe printed out as expected. Okay, and this again is what's referred to as an object method. It looks very similar to a function, except because it's inside of an object, that changes things dramatically in reference to scope and things of that nature. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about JavaScript scope. Okay, so scope refers to the accessibility of variable values within a function. Okay, so to explore this, let's first off start by creating what's called global scope. Okay, and global scope is simply where we declare a variable outside of any functions or conditionals or anything to that nature. Okay, so I'm just going to declare a variable up here called counter equal to 0. Okay, and so from here, we can create a function called increment. And the purpose of this function is to take the value of counter and add 1 and then we'll console log the new value of counter. Okay, and then instead of just invoking it once when the browser loads, I'm going to actually connect it to a button. And this button, every time it's clicked, will go ahead and will increment the value by running that function. Okay, so I'll say onClick equals increment invoke. Okay, so now let's go ahead and save all. Refresh our browser, and let's go back and add some context to that button. So I'm just going to say increment. Okay, when we click on increment, we can see that it's adding 1 to counter in memory, right? So as you can see, I can console log counter inside the function or outside the function. Right? It exists everywhere because it's global. You can see it loads in this console log first, right? And then each time I click the button, it's adding 1 to that initial value in memory each time. Okay? And this again is what's referred to as global scope. Now, if we were to take this variable declaration, we were to move it inside of this function, well, now this function has changed scopes, okay? And the scope is now referred to as function scope instead of global scope. So what that means is this function only exists inside of this function block. So now if I try to console log counter outside of the function, I'm going to get an error because it doesn't technically exist anywhere else except inside the function. So if we refresh, we can see that we get an error in our browser, right? Because counter is not defined. So now I can go ahead and I can click my button. Because counter is defined inside this function, this console log will run just fine. But something to take note of is because we're redeclaring the value counter to 0 each time this function runs, it's actually going to only ever increment to 1, and then it won't be able to get past there. Okay, so let's test this out in our browser by saving all. And we refresh. We can see that no matter how many times we click increment now, because we changed it to function scope, it's never going to get past the value of 1. Okay, so last kind of scope we'll talk about is block scope. And block scope very much has to do with the difference between our var and let keywords. Okay, so let's create a function. We'll call it scope test. Oops, probably should use the function keyword here. There we go. And the idea here is we're going to compare the difference in our var and our let keywords and how they affect scope of our functions variables. Okay, so I'm going to start by using var. I'm going to declare x equal to 4 within the scope of this function. Okay, then I'm going to put a conditional down here, which I'm going to force to run, which will create, a different scope of this block. And I'm going to declare x equal to 1. And then within that block, I'll console log the value of x. And then within this function block, I'll console log the value of x. And because var keyword does not use block scope, it's going to reassign the value of this x to 1 because that's the last thing that x was declared as in memory, okay? Which is bad. That means our scopes are overriding each other. We want those to be separate. So we refresh. We can go ahead now and invoke the function and run that in our browser. Okay. Now, as you can see, we're getting 1 and 1 now, which again is bad. That means this overwrote this. Okay. And so to avoid that, we can use the let keyword, which incorporates block scope. Okay. And so now they're blocked off from each other. Okay. Our scopes can't communicate. And so if I try to run this now, it's going to say 4 and 1 instead of 1 and 1 because these won't interfere with each other, resulting in the initial values they were assigned. Okay, so we refresh. We can see now we get 4 and 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's wrap up with the topic of JavaScript DOM events. Okay, so DOM events are ways we can piggyback off of the browser's document object model and create our own interactions within our program. Okay, so to best understand how to create these events, let's go ahead and console log the document itself. Okay, so go ahead and refresh. See that the document is the HTML nodes, right? It's the document right here, right? And so the document object is a little different though, and we can see the document object by saying console.dir. Okay, so we refresh now, and instead of just getting the HTML nodes, we actually get the document object itself, which as you can see is an object, and it's a bunch of built-in methods and values, right? And so all these methods down here, are linked to browser events, right? On click, on play, on error, on focus, right? I mean, they just pretty much cover everything. So let's go ahead and let's use a common one like on click to run an event whenever our button's clicked. Okay, so to do this, I'm simply going to set this button up with an ID, and we'll make this ID called my button. And then from here, I can start off by creating a variable called my button, which will be equal to document. Then I'll use the getElementById method to target the element with the ID of my button. And then from here, I can have what's called an event listener. Okay, so I can say my button.add event listener. And the event I'm going to listen in for is click. And when the click event happens, I'm going to run this callback function. Okay, and let's go ahead and let's say we just want to greet. So we'll go ahead and we'll throw up an alert, and we'll say, hello world. So from here, we can save all, and we can refresh. And now when we click greet, we can see that it uses that built-in event on our document object model to execute that function block. Okay, and that's how we can create browser events in our program. And as you saw, there were tons of them, right? I've only used one, the click event, but really, there's sky's the limit as far as the options go. So definitely feel free to browse over this as your curiosity leads you. Okay, so that being said, let's go ahead and open the floor one last time, see if anyone has any last questions today. Okay, so the floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask those now. Okay, everyone seems good. So thank you for stopping by. Have a great rest of your day, and happy coding out there.